Well, hello, a very good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you, depending upon where in the world you're joining us from. My name is Ken Ramirez, and this is Live from the Ranch. Joining me today is my co-host from JW Dog Training and Behavior in the Washington, D.C. area, Juliana DeWillems. Hi, Juliana, how are you doing today?
Hey Ken, I'm doing great. And I want to know, have you gotten that initial spiel memorized yet? Because what year are we going into as we start
I know
2026?
2020, this is our first broadcast of 2026. We began during the pandemic in 2020. So we have been going on 6 years of doing our broadcast. Used to be weekly, as you know, and then we switched to monthly. But I enjoy doing the broadcast, and I'm so pleased that you have been with us since the very first year and been involved, because your participation and being able to chat with you and riff with you and talk about things going on in the community is always a lot of fun.
It's just unbelievable that it's been so long. Do you think when you first started that very first broadcast, which by the way, you thought you could do it all by yourself, so I was not in attendance for the very first one, I
Yes.
started the second. Do you think you ever imagined it turning into what it has monthly for years?
No, not at all. I remember at the time it was the start of the pandemic, and we were all feeling isolated and alone and not able to go out and meet with people. And I just wanted to create a space where I could talk with fellow trainers, we could talk training and have a good time. And of course, if you recall back to the beginning of the pandemic, we all thought this is going to happen. This is going to take a couple weeks, maybe a month, and it ended up being years. And so
Mhm.
and then once the pandemic ended, we got into such a rhythm of doing these broadcasts and having fun talking to colleagues that we ended up continuing doing the broadcast. So I would have never thought we would be doing it for so long. And we've covered such a great variety of topics. And so, in fact, speaking of, I'm glad you brought up the fact that this has been around for so long, because this year we're bringing back a sort of a segment that we used to do at the beginning. At the beginning, we used to do a lot of live training and real world training and talking practical training and demonstrating practical training. Our final segment of the episode, we're going to start today and hopefully do this every month, is we'll do some kind of practical training segment where we show real training taking place and can talk about it with you. You and I can talk about it. We can get questions from our guests, from our attendees, and potentially include our guests as well. So I'm excited to get our broadcast started today. Our guests today are Allie Bender and Emily Strong, who've been with us before. But before we go to introducing them, I thought I would let you hear a word from our sponsors, which of course is Karen Pryor Academy. We are very, very pleased about the fact that the Karen Pryor Academy, we offer you the opportunity to build your skills and knowledge by enrolling in any of our on-demand courses, or take the next step in your animal training career by applying to our professional certification program with in-person or fully virtual workshops. You can learn more at KarenPryorAcademy.com. On the screen, you can see some examples of future, there it is again, some future upcoming workshops that are available. And those are just some of the ones that are coming up in the next few months. We have new workshops enrolling every single month throughout the entire year. And having said that, I would love to introduce you to our guests. They are returning guests. They are Allie Bender and Emily Strong. They're the co-founders of Pet Harmony Animal Behavior and Training. They're the co-authors of the wonderful book, Canine Enrichment for the Real World. This is one of my favorite books that's come out in the past 5 years. It's an excellent book. And then, of course, they followed that up with a workbook. And my understanding is they have an update for that book coming out, hopefully in the not too distant future, which is exciting. And they co-host the Enrichment for the Real World podcast. And along with their business partner, Ellen Yoakum, they co-developed and operate Pet Pro, which is a professional mentorship program through which they mentor and learn alongside behavior professionals worldwide. They are passionate teachers, skilled trainers, and they continue to make excellent contributions to our training community. Allie and Emily, welcome back to Live from the Ranch. Hello, Emily.
Thanks,
There you are.
Ken.
Allie, how are you?
I'm happy to be here.
I'm
Yes.
so pleased to have you both here. And believe it or not, we're not going to talk about enrichment, not in the strictest sense this time. I think today we want to focus our attention on the idea of classical conditioning. And
Mhm.
I think for many of us who learned about training from an operant perspective, classical conditioning is sometimes a mysterious outlier that we don't know very much about. Although there are those that started their training careers by learning about classical conditioning and they're very fluent in talking about it. But it dawned on me that maybe we should have a discussion about classical conditioning, its application, its function, its uses, why it's still valuable for us to focus on it. Because so often my focus tends to be on operant conditioning. So I thought I'd shift the
Mhm.
focus. So maybe we could start. I'm gonna direct my questions to either one of you at a time, and you can switch places if you want to. But Allie, I was going to direct my first question to you, and for those that may not really understand the difference between operant and classical conditioning, can you give us a simple, straightforward definition or explanation of what classical conditioning is and how it's different from operant conditioning?
Sure. So with classical conditioning, we're talking about a stimulus-stimulus pairing, and the end result is a change in feelings is what we're usually going for with classical conditioning. That's not the only result, but that is typically how we are using it, which is a little bit different than how we're using operant conditioning to achieve a particular behavior. And when I'm talking to my clients about this, I'm usually talking about counter conditioning, and I explain it to them as we pair a scary thing with an awesome thing until the scary thing becomes awesome, until we get the same feeling about the scary thing as we do the awesome thing.
Oh, I love that. That was a great explanation. And what I liked about it is you focused on the feeling, because I think we often talk about the fact that if you use classical conditioning well, you can change the emotional response that a dog gives you. And that can be an important thing. So, Emily, let me direct the next question to you. Um, I know I have my opinions about why it is, but do you have feelings about why so often in our community, trainers focus so much on operant conditioning and tend to not think about classical conditioning very much? Do you know why that is? Do you have an opinion about why that might be?
I mean, I think this is a beautiful example of a selection bias, and that you surround yourself with the trainers who take an operant first approach. And I think that is one of the reasons that Allie and I get along with you so well and work with you, because we have a mantra at Pet Harmony: when operant is possible, operant is preferable. So I love that you have that selection bias and you see that. I don't see that in other circles of training. But so my answer is, I think it's because of the teacher who is teaching them how to train, and that teacher's worldview, how they think about training, how they think about animal learning, how much they care about teaching formulas precisely versus how much they care about teaching the internal structure of behavior and letting the formulas kind of hitch a ride with that structure. So I think that that is probably why we see some trainers be really, really focused on operant conditioning and kind of forget that we have classical conditioning in our toolbox, and vice versa, why we have other trainers who are really focused on classical conditioning, and for them, they forget that operant conditioning is a really valuable tool in their toolbox, right?
I agree. I was having this discussion with Dr. Susan Friedman a few years back, and she said, "Oh, I'll tell you why people have a preference for one or the other." And she said almost exactly what you just said. She said, it depends on who their first teacher was. If they were
Yeah.
first taught by somebody who focused on classical conditioning, they view training through a classical lens, and operant conditioning just sort of comes along for the ride. But if their first teacher was an operant trainer and teacher, then they look at training through an operant lens, and classical
Yeah.
conditioning just comes along for the ride. Because the reality is, whatever you think you're focusing on as a trainer, both operant and classical aspects of learning are taking place all the time. Isn't that true?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. The
It's
distinctions are created by humans,
right.
right? And so, like, in reality, all of these things, they don't exist in compartmentalized little bubbles. They're co-occurring, right? It's really about how we are thinking about them, how we're paying attention to them, how we're using them, that makes them distinct. But really, learning is just all happening at the same time,
Right.
right?
It's all meshed together without it fitting into a neat little box. And I think that I understand as an educator why when you teach about something, you have to put it in categories.
Yes.
Even when thinking about your book, you had to divide it into chapters. And so consequently, something got taught first, and something got taught second, and something got taught third. But it wasn't necessarily because the thing that's the fourth chapter of the book is somehow less important than the first chapter of the book. They're just, you have to compartmentalize it just so that you have the ability to talk about it. So
I have to say, I want to just say thank you for bringing that up, because one of the things that we are changing about in the second edition of the book and the workbook is explaining that to people. Like, we are creating categories and we are giving you these steps to do an enrichment framework in a linear order, because that's the way teaching works. But now let's teach you how to use this in a more fluid, dynamic, realistic way, because in the real world, it's not that linear and compartmentalized, right? So thank you for bringing that up.
no, it's one of the things that confounds me often as a teacher. I'll teach about a concept, and then someone will raise their hand and say, but that sounds an awful lot like this other concept. And I'll go, oh, well, you're right. They do overlap. It's that nothing actually fits in a neat little package and box. It's all very messy. But the more you understand it, the more I think you're able to use all of this information that you gain, and you're able to put it to work when you recognize that it doesn't always come in that really linear order. So as you've worked with trainers and consulted with clients and worked with people, and what do you think is missing from people's education as it relates to classical conditioning? And I don't mean everybody, clearly, but what do you constantly seem to find that the average trainer misunderstands about the use of classical conditioning?
I have thoughts, but I'm going to let you go first, Allie.
Allie, go ahead. I'll take this one first.
I see two different things, and it goes back to that that discussion that we just had of, it depends on which one you typically view training through, like which lens you typically view training through. When it comes to trainers who are viewing through that classical lens first, and sometimes, operants just coming along for the ride, I think one of the biggest things that's missing is skill building. Of, yes, changing feelings is really important. A lot of times, especially with the animals that Emily and I work with, you kind of have to change feelings before you can even try to do skill building, in an efficient way, I should say. But there's more work to do after feelings have been changed. We still have to teach them skills so that they can navigate difficult situations, so that they know what to do when they do have feelings of distress. And then on the other side of the coin, for trainers who are viewing through Operant, not necessarily like that, forgetting that feelings are important, because I know that operant trainers know that feelings are important. But I think knowing how to leverage that in their training, of, it's so much easier when you have a situation with an animal who is in distress to say, like, okay, let's do a little bit of working on the feelings first until we get that moment where you're like, right here, they are still learning even in the presence of a stressor. Now let's switch to operant. And it's just easier, in my opinion, to do it that way.
Good. I like that. Emily, do you have a follow-up to that?
I do. I think in addition to the awesome things that Allie said, I see a lot of times people trying to use a marker of some kind when they're doing, when they're trying to do some kind of classical conditioning, usually counter conditioning. They're trying to use a marker because that's how they've been trained to mark behavior, and they're forgetting that by definition, classical conditioning is not about the learner's behavior. It's a passive type of learning where we're just helping them to make associations. And the reason that's important is because if you don't have clarity on what behaviors you're clicking, and you're just trying to do a counter conditioning procedure, clicking things can really confuse the learner and sort of work against the counter conditioning that you're trying to do. Another mistake that I often see with the people who have kind of come from that classical conditioning background and are forgetting, sorry, so coming from the operant conditioning background, and like Allie said, are forgetting that positive reinforcement does not necessarily equal appetitive experiences for that animal, or meeting that animal's needs, or paying attention to what they're motivated by, is people can conflate positive reinforcement with counter conditioning and assume that counter conditioning is happening because they're using positive reinforcement. But we see a lot of times where we have increased or shaped a behavior through positive reinforcement, and the animal still feels yucky about it. They'll do it because of the food, or they'll do it because of the relationship that they have with their trainer, but they're not feeling great about what they're doing. They're doing it because it's the expectation. And so I think that Allie, we've talked about this in the podcast, Allie has been bitten by a dog because of that training mistake.
Right.
Where the trainers of that dog taught that dog to approach people for clicks and treats, did not pay attention to the dog's emotional state, and the dog learned that she approaches people, and she approached Allie and bit Allie because she was not comfortable doing that behavior. I want to be clear that Allie was not the one who cued her to approach.
I was just standing there,
living your life,
minding my own business.
So I think that's another really big important thing that people kind of forget about, right?
No, I appreciate that. And it's interesting because I totally understand where you're talking about, where someone is using an operant approach, but they're also stating or believing that they're also doing some classical conditioning, some counter conditioning at the same time. And while I know some skilled trainers who are able to apply both at the same time and have both intentions happening at the same time, it is so easy for people to make mistakes when they apply them. And I think we'll probably get into that in our second segment here in a minute. So maybe it begs the question that I want to ask the both of you. You have a client who comes forward and they have a concern, they have a challenge with their dog, and you're trying to help them overcome a challenge. And as you look at the dog, and you see whatever the problem that presents itself is, I would imagine there are times that your first instinct is, oh, this would be very helpful if you trained this particular behavior, and that's how you might resolve this. And there are other times when your first thought is, we need to change the way the dog feels about this situation and apply a counter conditioning protocol or something of that kind. How would you say you make the decision after assessing a dog, after assessing a situation? What prompts you to say, this is where I need to pull out my classical conditioning tools?
Yeah, I'll start, Emily, because you'll have more things to say. So for me, and Emily already said this, of when operant is possible, operant is preferable. And so it goes back to, is operant possible to do in this situation? So I think resource guarding is a really easy example for this of, let's say we get a resource guarder in and it's like, yeah, it's totally safe to teach trades. It's safe to teach drop it, like all of those things. And then there are some kiddos who are like, I'm going to mess you up if you come within 10 feet of me and a thing that I have. And it's like, oh, we're not working on trades with that. Like, we're going to get bitten if we try to do trades. And so in that case, I need to be able to be within, let's say, 2 feet of you and moving my hands and all of that. And in that case, I'm going to start with a classical approach until it is safe for me to use a more heavily operant approach.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, Allie and I met at a sanctuary where we were working with a lot of dogs who were under sustained high intense stress. And there wasn't enough space to move those dogs out of that context. And so we had to start with just a very basic trace conditioning protocol of like, we walk by, chicken flies over the fence for several days before we could even get the dog relaxed enough that we could start to do operant training, or feral dogs or puppy mill dogs who are so shut down that they can't learn because they can't even, like, they're not even aware of their surroundings. They're just completely closed off. So we have to start with, let's change the way you feel. Let's make this a safe space where you can relax enough. Or if we're working with a dog who is really, really has really big responses to something that happens so fast, you don't have time to do a cue behavior consequence, like 3-term contingency. All you have time for is like just chucking food at their face. Like, so like there's so many situations like that where it's like, we need to be intentional about classical conditioning because operant conditioning is not practical in this context. Right.
That's an excellent response. And I kind of want to dig into that and maybe ask you for a few examples that you could give me. And I thought that was a really good lead into that. But here's what I'm going to suggest. I'm going to take a quick break. I want to remind our viewers that if you have questions about classical conditioning that you'd like to ask Allie and Emily, don't hesitate to put them in the chat window, and Juliana will bring them up in a few minutes. In the meantime, I do want to talk about a great lineup of upcoming events that we have. Most of them are in-person events, and I wanted to make sure to tell all of our viewers about them. In March, we are bringing Clicker Expo, our animal training and behavior conference, to New York. The annual conference brings together hands-on learning, world-class positive reinforcement educators, and an energizing, supportive training community, all conveniently located in Westchester County, New York. Registration closes on March the 5th, so you have exactly 1 month to get those registrations in. You don't want to miss an opportunity to attend Clicker Expo New York. Then in April, we're going to kick off our season here at the ranch, which is just about an hour south of Seattle. We offer both week-long immersive experiences and weekend workshops and seminars. Our early bird savings ends March 1st, so I really encourage you to take a look now if you're considering joining us. I'd love to see you at the ranch. You can learn more about Clicker Expo and the ranch at clickertraining.com. So having said that, let's bring our guests back up onto the screen, and just going to give a quick shout out since we just talked about Clicker Expo. Last year, Allie was in our in-person at our in-person expo, and this year Emily will be teaching at our in-person expo. I'm really looking forward to that. But what I'd love to continue is our discussion about classical conditioning, and you were giving us some examples of when you might choose to pull out the classical conditioning tool. I think the example you gave is you were working in a shelter or sanctuary situation where you sometimes run into situations where the dog's just not comfortable and you just want to change the way they feel about a situation. Can you give an example similar? It may be very similar to someone who's not in a shelter, but where you're working with a home client, a pet guardian, where you find the first tool you pull out of the tool bag ends up being a classical conditioning tool.
Yeah. When I was in Salt Lake, I had a client with a blue heeler named Ranger, and Ranger had a lot of complicated feelings about a lot of things in this world. And one of the things that we discovered very early on is that Ranger couldn't actually do any of the learning that I had in mind for him because he was so stressed about the environment that he just couldn't focus on anything. And so we went way back to the beginning. First of all, we got a VB on board and got medications on board. That's obviously part of it. But we just started with like a preference test to figure out what he really valued. And then if you approach the front door, you get this super special thing. I wish I could remember what his thing was. It was something funny like frozen peas or something, but whatever his favorite thing was, if you come to the front door, you get that. If you cross the threshold, you get that. If you step on the welcome mat outside the threshold, you get that. And we just gradually worked him up, and we would always leave the door open so he could go back inside at any point. But we just started with leaving your house doesn't always have to be a terrifying thing. Let's start there. And then we can work on the different skills that we wanted to build with you.
That's excellent. You know, one of the things that's interesting to me, and I kind of like to sort of get your take on where and when you were introduced to classical conditioning. For me, I I was introduced to training from an operant perspective very, very early on. And when I began being introduced to classical conditioning in the early years, I was like, yeah, that's interesting. I don't really need that. And you know, you just kind of dismiss it because of what your learning history has taught you. And then while as an operant trainer, I find myself being better and better about incorporating classical conditioning concepts into my operant training, I also became aware of how little I really understood about it and how it's taken me a long time to get to a point of clarity about its importance and its value to training. So I have a couple of questions that follow that, but I'm very curious to know where each of you was first introduced to classical conditioning. Was it the first thing you learned about training? Did it come later in your career? Where did you learn it? I'll start with you, Allie. How did you come to understand and get to be a practitioner of classical conditioning?
Uh, that's a great question that I don't have a definitive answer to. I will say that I went to college for animal science, and I took everybody is like, oh, you must have learned how to be a dog trainer there. And I was like, no, I learned about cows there. Actually, I went to an agricultural school, so I know a lot about cows. But because I was interested in behavior, I took a lot of human psychology courses, as many as I was able to take. And so I learned about classical and operant conditioning in human psych courses. And that was really where I was first introduced probably to the concept. It wasn't until many, many years later that I was able to actually apply the theory of what I had learned in school to what I was doing with animals. And I don't know necessarily why I saw the lens through a classical conditioning or through the world through a classical conditioning lens when I was taught both probably around the same time. I have no idea. That's what my brain liked.
No, it's interesting because before I get Emily's response to that, I have if someone were to ask me that very question, I realized I couldn't pinpoint it either because it eked into my understanding and became bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
And then I sought out other resources. And at some point I felt very comfortable that I felt like I knew enough about it to really grasp it. But at the same time, I realized I understand it really well. I don't think I want to teach a course about it because I just don't feel that grounded in it because it's one of those things that crept up on me over time. How about for you, Emily?
Well, like Allie, so I double majored in linguistics and psychology. And so I think I must have been exposed to these concepts in college. But I didn't, I mean, I didn't take any classes in behavior analysis. So I don't even know for sure that I was exposed to that in college. But when I first realized that I didn't want to keep working with animals the way I had been working with them, the very first thing that I did to sort of like dip my toe into a more science-based approach to training was taking Susan Friedman's PBAS course, the Parrot Behavior Analysis Solutions course. And then I took living and learning with parrots, and then I took living and learning with animals. And so her courses were the first place that I learned about them in a way that, like, I think I was like, oh, that sounds familiar from school, but like I didn't really, it was just kind of theoretical fluff. And Susan's courses were the first ones where I was really like, oh, I get this. I understand them. I understand how they interrelate with each other. I understand why they are relevant to what I would how I would prefer to interact with animals. And so I learned them at the same time because of Susan. And then being neurospicy, I started collecting textbooks and reading textbooks. But I want just to your point, Ken, I'm still learning about these concepts.
Oh, yeah.
And there are things that like I had read in textbooks before and they didn't really sink in. And then like very recently, I was like, wait, what? are you sure? And I go back to my textbook. I'm like, there it is. Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh my God. Like, whoa, okay, wow, I did not register that at all, because you're so used to like the dog training echo chamber that you just get used to how dog training talks about these definitions, and the ones that are in the textbooks don't really sink in because they're not really relevant to what you're doing in the moment, right?
Right.
So I just want to say, like, I still feel like I am still going back over the very basic foundational information repeatedly to get to learn more.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a sign of a true lifelong learner. I totally agree with you. There are so many times in my career that I've picked up an article or a book that I read years and years ago, and I thought, oh, let me just reread it. It'll be fun. And all of a sudden, I see this nugget of wisdom that I thought, this wasn't here before. This must be a new edition. And it turns out it was there all along. I just wasn't ready to receive it. I wasn't at a place in my learning where it made that it was relevant to me at the time. And so it's amazing how often you can look back at historical literature and find out most things that people think are brand new ideas have actually been studied, talked about, and used many, many, many times in the past. So one of the things time is just flying by here, I wanted to bring up to everybody that's listening and watching is that last year I made the decision that we needed a good classical conditioning course for trainers to take. And I put the word out to a number of different trainers saying, would you be interested? Do you feel qualified? Do you think you could teach a classical conditioning course? And it was amazing to me how many excellent, skilled trainers came back and said, I'm not sure I can teach this. I'm more operant focused, but I think it's a great idea. And in my long search for the perfect people to teach the course, I didn't stumble across you two. I've known about you for a long time, but I became very aware of the fact that you had an understanding of using classical conditioning really well. And we're going to be, you both are creating a course or two courses for KPA that will be releasing in the months ahead. And we'll be talking about when and where at another time. But we've divided the course into classical conditioning part 1 and classical conditioning part 2. And so, Allie, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the part 1, because you're going to be the main instructor for the classical conditioning part 1. What is the focus of that particular class, that part 1 of classical conditioning? What are you going to be teaching us if we take the class?
Yeah, so part 1 is really about just the classical conditioning part of it. And that sentence will make more sense when Emily starts talking about part 2. But just about the classical conditioning part of it, the first part is a little reminder of what people would have learned in LLA or will learn in LLA of like, here's the definition of these. There's also a discussion of, and I should back up for a second and say we're including systematic desensitization in this course as well, because that's how most dog trainers are talking about it, is counter conditioning plus systematic desensitization. So we kind of have to talk about it there. But part 1 does include a discussion about how dog trainers have bastardized the term systematic desensitization, and what they are typically doing is not the actual protocol that a human psychologist would use for systematic desensitization. And where do we go from here with that? I don't have an answer of where to go. I'm just going to keep using the bastardized term. And then breaking out those two different protocols of looking at what does systematic desensitization, the dog trainer version of it, look like on its own? What does classical conditioning and counter conditioning look like on its own? And then pairing those two things together to how we would prefer and typically use that type of protocol.
No, that's great. And I totally get what you're talking about. There are so many terms that come from psychology or from behavior analysis that we have tended to use quite normally in everyday discussions about training. And oftentimes we use them in a context that doesn't really correlate with the way they were really defined. And so I think as professional trainers start using classical conditioning, it would be very helpful for them to truly understand the history and origin of that science and of the terminology. So I think that's going to be great. So Emily, you're going to be teaching part 2, which I often think of it as the now let's talk about applying this, but maybe you can give me a more general description of what part 2 will be about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sound. Allie's doing theory and I'm doing application. So essentially, what we're going to be teaching in that is, can you align what you think you're doing with what you're actually doing? Can you align your perceptions with definitions? So can you identify contexts in which a classical conditioning approach would be more helpful to us, and when an operant approach would be more helpful, knowing that they're both happening at the same time. But what we mean by that is, which one, where do your criteria live? Do they live in the classical realm or the operant realm, right? And then we're going to be like, can you identify the difference between extinction and spontaneous recovery? Can you identify the difference between systematic desensitization and exposure therapy? Can you identify the difference and implement the difference between trace conditioning and delayed conditioning? Can you see when simultaneous or backward conditioning are happening? So it's, can you do it now? Can you show me that these concepts that Allie has been teaching you in part 1 actually live in your bones now, and you can actually do the things and see them, recognize them in the real world, and implement them in the real world, right?
That's a great example, and I'm so pleased that you use those examples. I'm going to ask Juliana to join us because we're almost out of time, and I thought Juliana's been listening in on this discussion. I don't think I've seen a lot of questions pop in, but I did want to make sure that Juliana often has great questions of her own, so I thought I'd check and see. As you've been listening to this discussion, Juliana, did you have questions that you'd like to ask of either Allie or Emily?
Oh, I could spend the rest of the time asking questions. So one that I have is, what are some behaviors that you look for that indicate a classical conditioning protocol is working and is effective?
Yeah. I mentioned earlier, like, there's that moment where you can see it, and it's like, I just love that moment so much, where usually, because a lot of times, especially in the situations that Emily and I have had to rely on counter conditioning, the animal is over threshold. They're yelling their little fool heads off at us because they are not comfortable in the situation, and there's nothing we can do about that. And so, you walk past, you're tossing chicken, and there's this moment where you walk past and you see those little gears turning, where it takes just like half a second until they bark, or they're like, look at the ground for the chicken before yelling at you. And once you see that like little moment of hesitation of like, wait a second, I think you're the chicken lady, that's when I'm like, that's what I'm looking for. Now let's switch to Operant because I got what I needed.
I have an alternative response that we love to see. What I'm going to use Arrow as an example. Allie worked with a dog who was legitimately very, very reactive and aggro about it, like scary, like he had a bite history. And so Allie just started with counter conditioning at first.
Okay, hold up. I have to redeem myself. It was the people before me for years did it. I came in to he had already.
Yes. Allie inherited a mess. Okay, I'm not going to the bus. What I'm saying is, you recognize that he was too stressed to start with Operant, so you started with counter conditioning, and it was successful, but not in reducing his reactivity. It's that his reactivity went from looking like to like, you now, spacing, you're gonna die. Like, and then once Allie could see that he was like wiggly threatening, then she could be like, okay, you are ready to actually learn a different skill, because we don't want you to continue yelling at making death threats through the gate, right? So that's a fun one. I love Arrow as an example. It is delightful.
Those are great examples, and I think that's some of these examples that we're talking about are such important examples of why learning about classical conditioning and understanding how to use it can be so helpful in your career as a professional trainer. So we're gonna share with you how you can learn more about this course in just a few moments. In fact, I just want to thank Allie and Emily both for being with us today. This has been a wonderful discussion, and I understand you're willing to stick around. Juliana and I are going to jump into our focus
Yes.
on practical training segment, which has nothing to do with classical conditioning, although as we all know, classical conditioning is happening all the time. But I'm going to be looking at more of the operant version of what I'm doing as I talk a little bit about protected contact with dogs. And so before we do that, thanks for joining us on Live from the Ranch today. I know you're going to stick around, so I'll be seeing you here in just a few minutes. And in the meantime, let me tell you one of the places where we're going to use that classical conditioning course. Over the years, there have been many, many trainers who've told us that your cases are becoming more complex. They're becoming more variable. There are higher stakes. There are fewer obvious answers. And that's why we've been working on something truly special for experienced trainers ready to take their skills to the next level. We're going to be talking about that on February 19th. We're going to do a big unveiling. And hint, hint, you're sort of hearing about some of the things as we talked with Allie and Emily about their classical conditioning course, but it's much more than that. We're going to be looking at a variety of different opportunities for you to learn more about behavior consulting and how to take those skills to the very, very next level. So we hope you'll join us then. And of course, at that point, we'll be also announcing a new website where you can learn more about some of these courses. So that's coming up very, very, very soon. So Juliana, as I said, I was hoping to get back to our roots and do live training as often as we could. And then as we were planning this, I thought to myself, oh my goodness, it's February. It's going to be freezing. And of course, it turns out that today is like 60 degrees here in Washington. We could have gone outside, but I didn't want to predict that. And it just so happens that in January, I was working with some people that were wanting to learn how to use protected contact with dogs. And I've always used protected contact extensively in my zoological career. And then I've also used it a lot in the work that I've done with dogs. And so my old dog Marlin was looking very frisky a couple of weeks ago, and I decided to film him doing protected contact just for fun. I retired him 2 years ago from being a demonstration dog because this year he is going to turn 17 years old. And I just, I think he loved training, but I just could sense that bringing him out on a certain schedule to do a demonstration for my classes, I just thought it was asking too much of him. But every once in a while, when he's in the right mood, I'll bring out my camera and film training with him. So you're going to see a little bit of that training. But one of the things that I often tell people that are interested in doing protected contact is if that's a new way of training for you, I would often start with the most basic concept, like, will the animal approach you and will they eat from you? Those are the behaviors that you need before you do anything else, before you think about targeting or medical behaviors or anything like that. And so I'm going to give you a demonstration of my old boy Marlin a couple of weeks ago as I was demonstrating or showing how I would start. And you're going to see in the video that I'm using a donkey pasture. So there's lots of donkeys in the background braying and things like that. But you'll see that I've put cups on the inside of the enclosure so that I could feed Marlin without putting my fingers through the fence, so that I could feed Marlin and just get him used to coming to me and eating from me. And then if he eats from me, can I have him follow me somewhere? Can I follow me to another location? So I'm going to try to share my screen so that you can see what I'm doing with him.
Ken, before you share, can you just share for the audience, talk about quickly why protected contact is important and why they should learn about this skill?
That's a great question. Thanks, Juliana. For me, protected contact is helpful for a lot of reasons. One, if you're working with a dangerous dog, an aggressive dog, a dog that you don't know its history, working in protected contact provides you, your veterinarian, with the safety to be able to work with the animal without worrying about being bitten. But it's not just for aggressive dogs. If you're working with shy dogs, timid dogs, fearful dogs, protected contact might be helpful, not because you're worried that they're going to bite, but you just see that they're afraid of you. And by being able to work on the other side of a fence often causes them to be more relaxed. So as we watch Marlin here, he is not a dog that needs to be worked in protected contact. And he's not a dog that is at all dangerous as far as I'm concerned, but I still like to teach all of my animals to work in protected contact, because sometimes when you're doing medical procedures that are uncomfortable, the vet just feels more comfortable if the dog is in a protected contact situation. So I'm going to share my screen with you right now. There we go. Let me pull it up and let me just show you me just starting with basic feeding. Now, understandably, Marlin knows me and he's not afraid of me, so he's perfectly comfortable coming up. But whenever I start training for the first time in protected contact, I want to see that my dog understands how I'm going to feed him. Will he be able to get the food from the bowl? Will he follow me? And of course, a good protected contact system is set up so that I can put food in that bowl without putting my fingers through the fence, so that it doesn't give the dog an opportunity to bite me. And as you watch Marlin move right there, you can sort of see some of his arthritis kicking in. But he's still eager to work. And that's how I tend to start, is just getting the animal really, really comfortable with the idea of working with me in that way, and being comfortable with what Mary Hunter might call a reinforcement strategy, a way of, here's where I'm going to feed you, this is where I feed you from. And for some animals, I just tend to find that if it's the first time you've ever worked them that way, they may not have any clue how to eat that way. And so teaching them to approach you and teaching them to eat that way is sort of where I start. Does that make sense, Juliana?
Totally. And what an excellent example of how you would introduce that. You made it look quite simple, I will say. It probably wouldn't feel that smooth to a brand new human learner, but it looked great.
And it probably wouldn't be that smooth even for me if it was the very, 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 very first time Marlin had ever worked with me. How he's not ever worked in this context in protected contact, but I've often worked him in other types of protected contact. Now, the next thing I tend to introduce him to is the idea of targeting. If I have a dog that targets, there's lots that I can do with the target. So it's the same setup, and you're going to see me bring out a target just so that I can get him to follow me and do the behaviors that I want. And it's no different than what you just saw. I'm just adding the concept of, okay, now that you're doing that, why don't you follow me from place to place? All right. Are you able to see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay. Donkeys are making their feelings known in the background. Like, why aren't you training us right now?
Yeah, it's our turn.
And again, this is not his first introduction to targeting. It is his first time targeting in protected contact, but he knows what a target is. He's been trained with the target his entire life. So introducing it to him in a protected contact setting shouldn't be too difficult for him. But I say shouldn't because sometimes just the fact that there's a fence between you and your animal can change everything about how they perceive the behavior. And I often suggest to people who are just starting out with protected contact, you can do this kind of thing, what I'm doing right here. I might do that for a few days or a few weeks until you really get a good system of reinforcement in place. Any questions about that? I could just babble on all day, and I should just pause to see if you, Allie, or Emily have any thoughts or comments about this before I go to what I think is the more important step that I want to show you in just a few minutes.
It's beautiful. What you did is gorgeous, and it just reminded me of all the times that I had to start working with parrots or unsafe dogs in protected contact, and just like you said, just getting the food, getting them to be comfortable taking food from you or in your presence. It makes me so happy.
One of the things that I did early on when I was in Chicago and in charge of the training program at the aquarium, we built a relationship with the Chicago Animal Care and Control, which is the city shelter. And we would have our trainers go and work with dogs they'd never worked with before. And I always insisted that at the start, they work in protected contact, just so that they could see, is the dog comfortable, and are they coming to eat from you, and are they showing you signs of discomfort or aggression, things that can inform you before you decide to open the door and go in with them. And to me, that was a really big thing.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I often work toward, though, is oftentimes being able to get access to an animal so that you can do an injection or tactile on parts of their body. And one of the things that I learned in the zoo community is that we often would try to find ways of putting a barrier that would allow the animal to walk between the front of the enclosure, the cage front, and that would cause the dog or the animal to come really close to you. And what I liked about that is it was like a squeeze cage or a restraint device, except for the fact that it's open on both ends. So when the animal comes in, they have the option of knowing they can keep on walking. And so what I did with Marlin is I took just a typical folding table, put it into the enclosure and put it several feet back and had him walk between the table and the fence. And as he got comfortable with that, I moved the table closer and closer and closer until eventually he's in this very tight space, still has the option to leave, but it allows me to touch his rear end without him being able to turn around and bite if he was so inclined, and allow me to have access to parts of his body. So I thought this is a little bit of a longer video than the other two that'll show you that process. And let me just share this with you right here. And can you confirm with me that it's running, Juliana?
Yes.
Okay. All right, good. So this is where I'm arranging the environment so the dog is almost forced to bring his body parallel to the fence. You can see it's just a folding table, a picnic table, and I just have him walking. I've started it further away, and then I brought it closer and closer and closer, and this is the second to last approximation to where it's still enough space that he doesn't have to have the table touch him. But you can see I'm able to touch him with my target stick. Made him a little uncomfortable at first, so I say, okay, that's fine. We don't have to do it all the time. Let's just get you comfortable walking through the space. You'll notice the first time I had him stop while he was in that space to be able to be reinforced. And this is a very comfortable thing for him to do. All he's really doing is following me. It just so happens that there's something forcing him to stay closer to me, which then allows me to eventually begin working toward doing tactile, doing various types of husbandry or medical behaviors with him if I needed to. And because I know he's really a familiar, well-trained dog, I knew that I could move pretty quickly. So right after this session, I'm going to pause the video in just a second.
Good. Excellent.
And then what I do is I'm going to move the table closer. Now he's just coming between me and the table really easily. So I bring the barrier as close to the fence as possible with just enough space for the dog to pass between the barrier and the fence. And I try to get the dog comfortable with tactile on his backside. And you're going to notice that I will try that once. I'm going to stop him. No, this first time I'm just going to walk him right through just to make sure he's comfortable going through that very tight space. And after he passes through a couple of times, and I reinforce him well, you can hear Marlin's heavy breathing. His old body is just like, okay, I'm kind of tired now. So I keep the session short. Here I do some reinforcing in the middle of the table, but I see, he's not totally comfortable being touched. You saw the way he sort of backed up. So I say, okay, and let me just reinforce you. And then let me see there's an opening on the end, and I'll reinforce you there. And then I decide for this session, I'm not going to try to touch him any longer, but I am going to just walk him back and forth. But you notice if I'm not careful, he goes, I'll just go around. And so I say, that's all right. He has that choice. And this time I'm not going to make him pause. And then I reinforce him well for still trusting me and coming between the table and the fence. And my decision here is I'm not going to do any more tactile with him until he gets a little bit more comfortable with just walking through the space. And the thing that helps me keep him from going around the table is the target gave him something to look at and focus on getting between the table and the fence. But it was just a great way for me to show the people, my clients that I was working with, the value of working in protected contact and being able to be safe, even when working with either a skittish dog or a fearful dog. So those were just some examples of how I did that. And so that was just my introduction. And I realized a lot of times people just aren't sure where to begin with protected contact because it's not something they need or have never thought about how to begin that training. And I actually ended up over the course of 5 or 6 days was able to do a whole series of like 15 videos with different protected contact concepts with Marlon. Those were the only 3 I brought today to share with you, but I thought you might find them interesting.
And you know what's so interesting about protected contact, for those of you watching who might think, oh, I don't, maybe work with aggressive dogs, I won't need that. One thing that I think is so valuable about working in protected contact is it forces us as trainers to get really good with our skills, because we can't do things that we might have done unknowingly, like leaning into the dog or using our body to influence their behavior or, reach for them in certain ways. It just really forces you to get good at your mechanics, your timing, your delivery, all of that.
You're so right about that. And the example that I have from the zoo community, I worked in the zoo community a long time, and long before protected contact was actually a system that was in place for training animals. And when the zoo community started insisting that large, dangerous animals like elephants, tigers, etc., be worked in a protected contact environment, a lot of the trainers were reluctant to do it, even though it was safer, because they just weren't sure, how do I get the animal to turn around? They were so used to touching the animal and manipulating the animal and moving the animal's body around to get an animal where it needed to be. Suddenly, when you didn't have that option, it wasn't hard, but it was hard only because you were using skills that maybe you hadn't used or in a way that you hadn't used them before. And it took a long time. Today, with several decades after protected contact became common, there's almost nothing that trainers find that they can't do using protected contact. They can do everything. It just took them many years to perfect it and figure it out. Now, Allie, you did a talk just recently at our Clicker Expo Live about using protected contact in a shelter environment. And why did you feel like that was an important topic to talk about at a Clicker Expo?
For so many of the reasons that you brought up already. Especially in a shelter context, it's just so much safer and sometimes necessary. I mean, I've worked in animal care and controls, and if any of them take domestic violence cases or rabies observation cases, you are legally not allowed to touch those animals and go in the kennels with them. And so you have to take care of them in protected contact. But one of the interesting things is after I got more out of sheltering and I was primarily focused on doing client sessions with regular pet parents, I used protected contact so much with my private clients. And I thought that was just normal because I had come from the sheltering world. And it wasn't until I started talking to trainers who had not come from the sheltering world. And, I would say something in passing like, oh yeah, of course I always have my clients put their dog away before I come into the house. And people are like, you do what? And I was like, well, obviously I don't want to get bitten at the door. And and it was just like little things like that where it was like, oh, I didn't realize that I had this skill because of my background in animal welfare that could be really beneficial for people who are coming into animal training from like the private client side.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And I agree. I think for me, when I work in the sheltering community, it never dawned on me not to work in protected contact. It was the go-to way to start with this unknown dog. And it certainly was when I brought my staff in and they were meeting these dogs for the first time. Even the dog that has a history of being super friendly, I would say do your first interaction in protected contact so that you can learn how it moves and what its behavior looks like and get a better sense of its temperament and its behavior before putting yourself in the same enclosure with this animal, especially when a lot of the dogs we would work with in Chicago were animals that were confiscated from fighting dog rings. And even though dog fighting is illegal, it still happens. And these dogs have these triggers that just set them off and they're like ready to kill. And you decide, safer way to start. So Before we wrap it up, Juliana, do you have any other questions before we wrap up this episode?
There's one question from the audience that I want to try to get to.
Oh,
The
sure.
Doghouse Rules asks, what strategy do you follow if your learner behind the barrier will not take food that close to you?
You know, and that's not unusual in my experience. That with a dog like Marlin, that would have been unusual. But for many, many dogs, if they're not comfortable, especially if they're a new dog into your home, or they're a new dog into the shelter, everything is new to them and they're uncomfortable. One of the things that I have done for a lot of animals that are uncomfortable is I'll come in, put food into a bowl or put food onto the ground and then leave. And then just watch and see if they eat the food after I've left. Often I discover that it's because I was in the space and they were uncomfortable with me that they didn't eat. So then when I discover that they're willing to eat when I'm not there, then I begin to say, okay, let me see if I can feed them and walk away, but keep myself within their visual range, and then gradually bring myself closer and closer and closer. If it turns out that the dog still isn't eating, even when I leave the room, well, then of course I have a couple of questions. Is the food that I'm feeding the appropriate food? Should I try several different types of food? Is there something else going on in the environment that is making the dog uncomfortable? What can I change in the environment? Are they hearing other dogs barking in the distance that's making them uncomfortable? I'll make changes to that environment because something will eventually get the dog to eat. As Karen Pryor was famously would say to people when someone said, well, my dog's not food motivated, Karen would go, oh, I'm sorry, is he dead? And her point was, if the dog is alive, he has to be eating. And if he's eating, he is food motivated. It's just that he's not food motivated in that context, in that situation. And what is it about that situation that's making him uncomfortable? And what can you change about that situation to make it easier for him to eat? Sadly, on that note, I'm going to have to wrap up this episode of Live from the Ranch. Allie, Emily, thank you so much for bringing your expertise to the table, for talking to us about classical conditioning, for sticking around as we talked about protected contact training with dogs. And of course, to Juliana, thank you so much for always being a wonderful co-host. I want to say to all of you, happy training. And right now, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about next month's episode of Live from the Ranch. So coming up next month, we are going to be joined by Dr. Susan Friedman. I think it will probably be her 4th or 5th visit on Live from the Ranch. But we're going to talk a little bit about her Living and Learning with Animals course. We're going to talk a little bit about the importance of understanding the science. We may even talk a little bit about the fact that she's created a new zookeeping training course that she's developed, and she's working with us on some big new behavior stuff that we're going to be doing as well. So we're going to be talking about all of that stuff next episode, which is March 5th, 1 p.m. Pacific time on YouTube here on Live from the Ranch. In addition to that, we want to remind you that we are always interested in your comments and your suggestions. If you have things that you'd like to share with us about things you'd like to see on a broadcast, people you'd like to see, comments about things you'd like to see us change, comments about things you love, visit us online, and there is an excellent place for us to get your feedback. We read every single message you send our way. And finally, to wrap up this episode, we just want to remind you of all of the different offers that we had to suggest about becoming a certified dog trainer, about taking on behavior case studies with confidence, and learning about that announcement coming up on February 19th, or some of our in-person events like classes here at the ranch or Clicker Expo in New York. Please go to clickertraining.com and learn more about all of these things. Loved having you all here. Happy training. We'll see you next month. Bye-bye.